Good day to you wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us once more. We are live from the Green Room. I'm Bruce Rose. I'm head of content at Live Group and I'm your host for today. And I'm joined by a very special guest. He is editor of Event Industry News and director at Event Tech Live, a man that really needs no introduction if you know anything at all about the industry. Adam Parry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on, Bruce. It's an honour, it really is.
Well, honor is a very bold word. I like it. I'm all for it. Thank you for spending your time and thank you for all the pre-work we've done. I think it's fair to say we've had a few conversations before coming to this live stream, and always I've left it with something incredibly interesting. I see that you're busy with a few other things at the moment. You've just launched a brand new event for 2021. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and keep it brief on that. Not an advert for me, but you know, many people will know that we deliver an event called Event Tech Live, a physical event that had to pivot to being a fully virtual event last November. But interestingly, what virtual has presented us is an opportunity to put some plans in progress that we felt have been on the cards and on the table for a while, which is to take and replicate the essence of what we have as Event Tech Live as a physical event and what we delivered in November, and you know, put that in front of an audience and mold that around another market. So we're taking the virtual Event Tech Live in its essence and focusing and curating something very much for the North American market, Canada and the US. Time zone it, speakers, content, language, everything. And that's something that we've had from our US event industry news audience and also our customers who kind of deal with events both sides of the pond. That's been a desire for them for a number of years now. So virtual's presented the opportunity to take that first step into that market, and we're excited to deliver that, whatever format that might take as well.
Very interesting. And can people get signed up already?
They can subscribe to updates. We're going to keep to the tradition of launching registration at a certain point out of the event, but they can certainly engage with us on social platforms. They can subscribe to show updates and things like that. But it won't be long before registration's open. So yeah.
So keep your eyes peeled, I think it's fair to say. Right, well then, if you're watching us right now, thank you for joining us. You'll see me occasionally just glancing in this direction, and that's because on this screen here in front of me, I have all the questions that you submit. Now, if you've watched one of these shows before, you know that while Adam and I could talk each other's ears off very, very happily, what we always want to do is provide information that's useful to you. So questions that you submit are always prioritized by me. Get them in. We'll be happy to tackle absolutely every topic. We've already had a few kind of points of discussion in advance, a few things we agree on, a few things we don't. And ain't that the brilliance of just talking to each other in this weird and wonderful world that we're in right now? So if you have a question, please submit it. In terms then of just kicking us off there, Adam, I really wanted to get your sense of where the industry is at right now in terms of we are still in the middle of a pandemic. We have a global vaccination program, the likes of which has never been seen. It's a real Manhattan project. And for many, it's an absolute linchpin of hope for what the world after COVID might be. If you're in events and you want to know your thoughts, what would you say in terms of where we're at? What do you feel?
There is no clear picture. I think let's be honest about that. Depending on where you are in the world, at what point of the events industry you help support, whether you're an organizer, whether you're in the supply chain, and even when you're an attendee, I think the picture is very different for many. There are there's lots of positivity out there of events coming back in some shape or form here in the UK, and we've seen already around the globe events happen. I was talking to an organizer the other day, and they've managed to conduct, I think, 13 trade shows in the APAC region. So events are happening, not quite now here in the UK. And then I think there is also, from an organizational point of view, both sides. People are still holding, waiting for physicals to come back because that's what they prefer to do. Others have tried, tested to some degrees of success virtual and delivered those, and are continuing to plan that that's the only thing that they will do for this year, even so much. And And then the supply chain, again, dealing with different elements. Some people who want to come back to physical, some people who want to continue down the safest route, which is a virtual. But I think the biggest thing that my takeaway is we're kind of in a transformative kind of state at the moment. There's never been so much experimentation, re-evaluating the business models of events. How can we be more resilient to future threats to our sector, like the pandemic? Maybe the next one is a financial crash or others. I hear many organizations who are probably thinking about not just being an event organizer, but being a publisher, a community custodian, I would say, because to own a community seems like the wrong word to use, but and almost looking at different forms of revenue and how to also support a client's desires as well in very much formats. That's probably not a super direct and one size fits all answer. But I speak to many people on many different sides of the coin, and everybody's got a different vision and opinion on it. That's what I'm seeing. It's really fragmented. There's lots of hope, but there's also lots of realization that we are where we are, and physical events still haven't had the go-ahead here in the UK.
Something we touched on briefly before, in terms of the ethos of the industry is such that it is very reactive. You listen to a client's needs. Depending on how fleshed out their brief is, you will begin to build an event for them, something that you can put on online or in person, whatever they may desire. And challenging what a client comes to you with is a very tricky thing. And if you're an event planner, obviously you have a fairly fixed idea in your mind of what you want. Now, I think pre the 2008 financial crash, it was very reactive. After that phase, as events began to shift, it changed slightly, and it's changing more, certainly in this pandemic. How good do you think the industry is at this kind of outreach, of educating clients in terms of what's possible, in terms of the different options, in terms of their benefits, their considerations? Because it's not really the skill set of the industry, is it? We're here to do amazing events, not necessarily to do outreach.
Yeah, your audience might not like me saying this, but I don't think we're exceptionally good at it. I think we fall into the trap of, we're a service industry. We like to provide satisfaction and deliver on what the customer wants, and ultimately we take direction for them. So if they want to go one way, we do our best to support them in doing that. But there is a massive difference in taking the role of leading our customers. Some do it well. As an industry, we could do a much better job of it because it's our sector. A customer may deliver one or two events or be involved in one or two events a year, so that's their full experience of the sector. Whereas us as organisers, as planners, as partners, as agencies, we see hundreds, if not thousands, of events a year, both in terms of us helping deliver them, but also experiencing themselves. Event profs go to events themselves and pick up tips and tricks and all that kind of stuff. So we should be leading from the front. We should have more conviction in what works in what format, whether that's digital, physical, webinar, 3-day event, 2-day event, roundtables, and the tools that we use to deliver that as well. And we should back that up with information and data, not just opinion. And I think that's something that we should and could get a lot better at. Let's be honest, we as an industry, we've waxed lyrical about the virtues of virtual events. Would we have done that so much if physical was possible? How quickly would we drop that conversation?
No. The answer to that question is no, because that was the world that we were in pre this pandemic, where the tech was all there, but there was no desire from anyone within the industry to push it, with a few exceptions. There is history that you can point to that says this was the case, and there are a few people that were banging this drum. I had a client say to me, "You were telling us about this for years, and now we have to do it," which was a bit of a knife in the side to hear. almost, because you want to talk about this in the positive terms, not the fact that we're doing a virtual event because the physical one can't happen. I want the conversation to eventually shift to, we're doing a digital event for these reasons, and they're really strong reasons, and the pandemic is not factoring in on them. I think delegate behaviours and such will be still key. You read, and this is slightly bleak, and if you want a more positive message, it's sometimes hard to pull out in a pandemic like this. But we may be with COVID for a very long time, and that from a different sort of strand perspective as this virus mutates, and obviously you think that the 1918 flu is still around now. It's just far less deadly because it's got itself attuned to humans, and that may happen with COVID. But delegate behaviours may be such that, there's a risk if I attend something in person, and for our industry that mindset is a very tricky one to balance. And you want to provide the amazing human experiences that events are known for, while still keeping delegates safe. And I don't think there's any doubt that delegate safety is so high on the priority list that it has to be treated seriously. So yes, we have to be a siren for these things, and we have to be an effective one. And I guess on the back of that, in terms of the damage that the industry can do to itself, I got an email this week from an agency who I won't name because it feels mean to put them on the spot, which was about essentially a budget offering for virtual events, and for under £1,000 you could have a platform and a system. Which, reading that made my skin crawl, not because I feel threatened by it, but I wonder the quality of what events come out of that, and therefore what people think about when it comes to virtual events, and will they just tune off because the industry will get saturated with, to be frank, crap low budget events. Do you think there's a race to the bottom right now?
I think in some respects, yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, a message like that from a company wouldn't come out. I wonder how that's driven in terms of why they've come to that decision. It'd be interesting to kind of peel the curtain back and ask them, is it a tactic to, carve up audience share and customer share in terms of a very low, kind of like the MailChimp model? It's free to start off with, although this isn't free. I've seen what Bruce is talking about. This isn't free, but it's low enough to get people into the machine, and then the team can do their job of getting that value up. But that's a dangerous route to go down, because you've set the bar of like what the value of all of this is. It would potentially create lots of competition from other suppliers as a race to the bottom. But then I've also seen on the other side lots of organizations and individuals cry out that suppliers are putting their prices up massively. I think there was one the other day of something in the region of 200% in the last 10 months. So some organizations are going the other way. I think price is somewhat always driven also by customer. Like, what's the value that as an industry we put on technology and the services associated with that? And what I'm talking about is not just the software or the tech, but the people that have to come around that to deliver a really, really good digital, virtual or physical event. Like, I've said this for a while, that SaaS for our industry should mean software and a service, because I do honestly believe that's where the value is. It's in the service element of utilizing that technology, whatever it is, in the best way possible to deliver on the objectives. But it's a dangerous model, because it puts a value on those events and on those event types of, it's only worth this much.
Yeah.
And I think
price anchors are a real thing.
Yeah, I think people will get caught out. They'll see that low price, they'll jump into it. This makes sense for me. It's 10x less than I'm being charged elsewhere. And then it will be literally on their plate to figure it all out, figure out how it works, build it, deliver it, deal with technical issues. Maybe you'll get a bit of support and all that kind of stuff. But maybe some people will be really comfortable with that, and that'll work for them,
Yeah, and we had a little informal poll before this broadcast with kind of two questions related to this. Was number one being, when do you think COVID-19 will be behind us? To which the vast majority were looking at 2022 as being the answer, which is perhaps unsurprising. And then, how important is cost in making a decision about your event? Well, no one said it was a low decision factor. The majority medium, and then a few people high, and so you get to this point where you feel like, from a planner's perspective, where you're building a virtual event, you feel like every line item needs to be justified in a very strict way. And when you actually take a step back, you realize that's a good thing. Very much that's a good thing. But when worlds are so tightly defined, coming up with a really inventive and amazing solution can be tricky because there's no leeway. Your only thing to work with is the client's vision, and therefore it comes back to, how do you effectively challenge the client's vision? But enough of my waffle. We've got some questions, Adam, which I'd like to get to. And I think you're perhaps really well placed to answer this one as a man that's ran a good number of digital and a good number of physical, and has been involved in those decision processes. And the question from Zoe is, how do you decide whether a virtual event will be as effective as a physical event? What factors do we need to look at to decide? Now, I have many thoughts on this, but I'd love you to kick us off if you don't mind.
Oh, it's Zoe. It's a big question, and one that's really difficult to answer. It sounds so cliche, but I guess you have to start off with the objective of what is the purpose of that event and who is that event for. Let's take, for example, a sales kickoff. Lots of them happening this year. Generally, it's a great opportunity to get an entire team who might be distributed together, build relationships and things like that. But probably it makes sense more cost effectively to do that online. And where can that budget be repurposed? Could that budget be repurposed in actually giving everybody a pay rise or a beginning of year bonus, or, not actually combining work and pleasure, and actually, defining that budget in somewhere else and taking everybody on a retreat that has nothing to do with work? And is that more beneficial? If it's, let's say it's an event that you just want to focus on your top 100 customers, then I would argue that's probably the objective there is actually relationships, and maybe that makes more sense in a physical setting, because it's more conducive to get to know people one-on-one in that element. And I guess the budget question comes into it as well, right? What's the budget for the event? If you've got 10K, probably much easier to deliver it online as a digital event than it is to find a venue, because your scope for attendance is much higher online, so you can attract a larger audience for not much more than your budget, for example. Whereas the more people in a physical setting, all the costs go up. So Zoe, unfortunately, I don't think I've given you a very direct answer to that question. It really boils down to what is the objective and who you're building the event for, I think, more than anything.
Yeah.
What do you think, mate?
Well, so the kind of second part of that, in terms of what factors do we need to look at, is really interesting to me, because, like, at the moment the factors are largely decided, and the number one factor being delegate safety. And so, well, I guess two factors. One being the legal world that you're in right now. If you're in the UK, you ain't running it. It's a nice, easy factor. True. If you're elsewhere in the world, there are different things that you could look at in terms of the delegate safety question, which is obviously, whenever you're thinking about physical events, those are going to come up first, which is the venue that you're operating in, the delegates that you're talking to. If you're dealing with an event that's primarily targeted at 20 to 30-year-olds, I think they'd be less sensitive to the questions of safety in terms of COVID, and therefore you may have slightly different answers. But you're looking at your audience makeup there, because it's a physical gate. If you can't answer those questions effectively in such a way that you're confident that delegates are safe, then your physical event isn't happening. Mm-hmm. Which I think is the that's the real monkey's paw of this whole world that I'm in from a virtual event perspective. Is for so long I wanted to talk about virtual events as a really viable alternative, and now, because people feel like they're being forced into the decision it's almost like, well, this is a compromise. And they're not a compromise. They are just a different way of delivering a message. And so I definitely echo that point about objectives. Objectives always come first. What is it that you're trying to do? And then once you combine that with the question about your audience, will my audience accept it in a different way? And then once you've made that decision, you have to beat that drum about the benefits of the route that you're going. So if you're going for a physical event, you really need to heighten communication around the fact that people will be meeting people, that it'll be like an opportunity to network, to connect, to converse, to have those informal little moments that often make an event spectacular, and market the hell out of it, because it's why we got into events. Humanity, we're social creatures. If you're deciding to go a virtual route, then you have to put that emphasis on the content, and in terms of the speakers that people will get access to, the talks that they'll hear, the ways they'll be able to interact with each other, albeit virtually, and really bang that drum. And that's also a perfectly valid way to look at it. And then obviously messaging around your speakers and such, you're going to see, I would say, if audience numbers are very critical to you as well, you're probably going to be wanting to go digital, at least for the near term, because the scalability of digital is incredible when compared to physical. That's not to say that it's perfect. Everything has its positives and negatives, which I think actually bridges onto a second question from Yasmin, which is the pros and cons of physical, virtual, and hybrid. And we could definitely talk about this all day, but I think for me, this idea of bucketing events is a dangerous one. We have people that think about this as a physical event, this is a virtual event, this is a hybrid event, and they mean different things. And I guess my ideal world in 2050 is we have a world where we think of events with different ways of getting out, like different routes to market almost. Like you'd have an advertising campaign with a blend of approaches. You'd have an event which is a blend of different methods, whether they be physical, virtual, or otherwise. But in terms of that, Adam, as you see it right now, and I think you have to divorce the pandemic from it, as impossible as it is. Yeah. When you think of physical, virtual, and hybrid, what do you maybe to keep this short, the top one pro and the top one con of each of those?
Okay, the top pro of a digital event for me is data, understanding what your audience actually does. And if I was to just slightly extend that, satisfaction to people in many different ways. It's something I don't think we focus on that much, actually, as an events industry. What's the satisfaction level of people at our events? But let's take a digital setting, just because of the technology and the ability to even anonymously track how our audience engages with us, gives us so much more information on what individuals do and what was of value to them and what was not. So it gives us a bigger, better picture. We can turn that into so many advantages. We can create new revenue opportunities. We can look at pockets of an audience and spin out other content elements or events and things like that. That's not to say that physical events don't have some of that same ability. But in the volume of it, digital events, as an organizer, as a publisher, for me, that's really, really interesting, because I do believe revenue for our events industry will much more largely be driven off of data-driven decisions. So as a publisher, as an organizer, we will make our decisions based on data. The benefits and cons of a physical event. The cons of a physical event will always be cost to me. And I'm not just talking about the organizer or the corporate or the agency that's having to pay all the supply chain and the venue and everything that goes around that event, because that's all factored in. It's all done on spreadsheets and project management before. Everybody knows what the cost of the event is. But actually more comes down to the individual that's attending that. To go to a physical event, the con is that I have to spend time away from my son, my family. I have to travel. There's costs associated with that. Is that really sustainable on big numbers, that kind of stuff? But the benefits are actually all the same. For me, it's a bit of travel. It's a time away from home. it's new experience. I'm very much a person who likes new input. I love new information, new knowledge, new input. And I love meeting people and shaking hands in a non-COVID time. I'm personally a social animal. So for people that are social animals as well, it's a great environment for lots of great things to come out of. And online, that for me personally, that doesn't necessarily always have the same serendipity that you get from physical social elements that revolve around events. I'm not sure if that's a good answer or a clear answer, should I say?
Hey, it's the audience who says whether it's a good answer or not. I thought you spoke very, very, very eloquently there. I think, from my perspective, the positive, the main positive of a physical event is memory. I know it seems like a bit of a strange thing, but the memories that people create at physical events often stay with them a lifetime if the event is at the right point in their life. And we forget that events are these, for some people, it's an intensely personal and unique thing. Now in the virtual event space, it's such a it's almost a very authored experience. We control the streams. Like the fact that right now people are seeing the framing of you and I in our little windows has been set by the production team. The production team being me for this, but let's ignore that. And so everyone's getting the same authored experience of how we look and how we sound, and that's not true with physical events. There's unique aspects that percolate throughout the event, even the people you meet by happenstance, and these memories get made from that. And isn't that just the most incredible thing? For me, the main negative will be and continues to be the being so innately tied with travel and transport, and managing that in a climate crisis is more critical. Now there's a future we can potentially get to with fully sustainable travel, whereby those questions begin to answer themselves. But for me right now, that's a tricky thing. For virtual, the main positive again for me is accessibility, which is a wide-ranging term, as it should be. But the barriers to entry being so low, if you're unable to travel, if you are stuck at home, if there are so many different confounding factors, but you can click a button and be connected to something, and that matters. The main negatives are the fact that it's tricky to do at scale. There's different costs all over the place. There are this idea that it is a lot harder to stare at a screen for 8 hours than it is to be in an event space for 8 hours. And those considerations are prescient and incredibly important. And the one which you missed out, Adam, which I'll have to throw back to you, we have a whole mound of questions, so you'll have to keep it quick, is hybrid. And for me, the main benefit of hybrid is resilience. You can be sure that no matter what happens, you have a route forward to deliver your event. Mm-hmm. And the main negative, the con, would be cost and complexity, because complexity often leads to cost. You made a really good point about in the pre-show discussion about how would you take one of these monstrously big physical events and make it hybrid effectively without also throwing on a load of cost. And there are some things that are very inescapable in that way. So what, from a hybrid perspective, Adam, what do you think?
I think hybrid will mean many different things to many different people. Some will go with a hybrid strategy, which, back to, I think it was Kate's point earlier, will be a choice over doing something physically or digitally, and it will come down to one or the other based on what the objective is. Other events, maybe the likes of Mobile World Congress, so not to increase necessarily the cost of people, which is probably the most expensive part of delivering events. And I didn't coin this phrase, it was somebody else, will go sequentially. So they'll have a digital element running, maybe wrapping the physical event, and the physical event will stay as a physical event with maybe some live streaming, some televised kind of the CNN of the event, kind of giving the highlights to people and a sense of what's happening there and then. And they'll play on that because that actually still gives a sense of that physical event being somewhat mysterious. What else is happening? What's happening in the bar and on people's stands and things like that? I can see it, I can tease it. So I think that's how we're thinking about things. Sequentially makes much more sense to us as an organisation because it's more manageable. It still provides value on both sides of the experience without just everything being crammed into that 1 or 2 days, for example. But back to your point, just resilience. It gives, if we plan for hybrid from the outset, then we are resilient to the next crisis, the next pandemic, the next thing that I don't know how many people are aware of this, but for the last 6 years, we've always had insurance in place, unfortunately, if the Queen dies. If the Queen dies, the whole country goes on lockdown for days. That's something that you have to bear in mind and plan for. And I think that's the same way that we can use digital virtual elements to our events, is to plan for all eventualities and cover all bases without necessarily detracting from what makes a physical event really special.
And we get no comedy on BBC for 3 weeks. It's another problem if the Queen dies. It's very sad. Great question from Mark, which I think you may be able to speak to quite well, Adam. Are there any major sources of research into the take-up/success of virtual events you would recommend that we look at? There's a bit of this where I'm going to have to dig up some links, and we're going to have to maybe send Marco a little pack afterwards. But are there any that spring to mind?
There's no dedicated research at the moment that I'm aware of. It's something that we're trying to work on actually in the background with a company called Explory. But it's the time frames that are the most difficult to work with, in the sense of the amount of virtual events that's happened, the experience of delivering them, and the learning curve, which also determines how successful they are, both from an organizational point of view, but from an individual's perspective as well, an attendee's perspective, because we've got to appreciate that for many of them, interacting with virtual events is something very, very new as well. So people are trying to still work it out themselves and whether it's of value to them. What I can give you is some anecdotal kind of information. There is one event in Brighton, a very well-known marketing event, that went from, I think, 10,000 attendees this year to 60,000. So they 6x their audience, all purchasing tickets. So a massive increase in audience acquisition for them. So fundamentally, on a business level, that was extremely successful for them. They allowed their wider network and people that were interested in that event to participate on multiple different levels. Probably in a very cost-effective way as well, when we mentioned travel and things like that earlier. But then on the other side, I know of a large-scale running event that tried to do something online because it's generally a consumer-facing event. It didn't have the success that the organizer hoped for, both financially and audience uptake. So there are varying levels of success. I've personally not seen what I would say is a mega event translating well online. I could mention a few, but it'd probably be unfair to them to point the finger at them. But actually,
quickly, Adam, make some enemies.
Yeah. Okay, CES is one, right? I think they have a great event. That's
the Consumer Electronics Show. If you don't, if an acronym, is just meaningless to you. Sorry.
Yeah. As an event, from what I saw, it was quite underwhelming from an attendee perspective. What was really interesting, though, was when individuals got into experiences created by those exhibitors, when they put the time and effort into creating a virtual experience on maybe their own platform, with real humans behind it, engaging digitally. That's where the special sauce was. That's where the spice was. But then you could argue, does an organization like that need a CES to be able to deliver that? It was almost a mechanism of marketing for them to get them to that environment. And I'd hoped that with the backing of somebody like Microsoft and the brands associated with something like CES and something like that, they would just do something that we'd possibly not seen before, or a different way of slicing it up. But it didn't seem, and it's probably, like I say, it's probably unfair of me because they're in the midst of the pandemic themselves. They had the challenges of last year. And time is against everybody when it comes to creating these experiences and these online events. That's why, we see the format of content delivered in this way works, because it's the easiest to achieve. But everything else that builds around that builds that special experience and that memories is the real challenging bit. So, yeah.
And I think Mark's kind of keyed into something that I think is a bit of a problem in the industry writ large, is it's terrible at sharing data and it's terrible at doing this analysis, and it often takes people kind of coming at it from a neutral point of view, saying, oh, is there anything you can give us and we can collate it with others and maybe create some useful learnings for the industry? But people are very protective of their data, and therefore it's very hard to grab any of these. We were talking about a bit of research from Microsoft, again in the pre-show, about how they're changing their marketing plan to have a lot more virtual after they've seen some success. But the big problem, or the big caveat I'd put on all of this is, with any of these bits of research, you have to know a lot about the audience, a lot about what they were trying to do to decide whether it was really effective. You know, there are virtual events which are a massive success. There are virtual events which are massive failures, and the reasons for each of those can be quite complicated, and the variables can be entirely hidden. And data analysis of this level takes a very long time. And so it may not be until 2022, 23 that we begin seeing some of these larger macro scale studies about the efficacy. That it also gets to a really exciting challenge in terms of how we measure audience engagement and audience sentiment effectively, to begin to publish some of that data. Because at the moment, it is links to another question we'll get onto a bit around about what metrics do you look at? What parameters do you look at? And there are so many, and what can be viewed as a success may in fact be a failure, and conversely, they are confounding variables in the truest sense of the word. So we have some stuff that I think we can pull together and maybe publish after this webinar, but it always comes with that big old caveat of what were they trying to do and who were they trying to do it with.
And I think to that point, mate, before we move on the data side, I mentioned this company already, Explorer. That is the one company that I feel is focused on our sector, is focused on exhibitions, corporate events, the market, and has done a really good job working with the likes of UFI for many years in trying to anonymously bring that data together and make sense of it. Because the fear is somebody's not going to want to necessarily give away their secret source or put their name to it. So back to Mark's point, if anybody's looking to add to that or to take from that, Explore is a really good place to start. They're the ones and they've done some work on virtual events, I believe, already. So, but it takes time to really make any sense of any of that data. You need time and repeat data to compare to see a change in any of it. And that's what I don't think we've had at the moment. We've not had a long enough time doing these and learning from them in order to compare. 12 months is not long enough, really. That's all.
Yeah, it was hard enough to get data reports during physical event space. It's not certainly going to happen in any time soon. But I guess just because we're talking about data, and it seems weird to come back to this point. Question from Vishnu: would it be great if you can share a set of parameters that you feel would be a good starting point to measure the impact of a virtual event? And again, I know what both of us are going to say. It comes back to objectives. What is that you're trying to do? If you're running a big sales event, virtual event, the number of leads you generate is probably a pretty darn good metric. If it's about learning objectives, there are ways that you can test that in a virtual space immediately to get a sense of how behaviors are changed. There are so many more interesting variables than number of people and time spent watching a stream, but you have to set them in advance. I know I'm talking over you, Adam. What do you think on this?
No. You're right. You have to really understand who you want to measure that about and why. But what I think we've got a huge opportunity to do with digital events specifically is really take people's opinion in the moment and see, were they satisfied with that piece of content? Was that the reason that they turned up? Did it deliver on what they individually want? Were they satisfied with the platform, with the length of the event? And this doesn't necessarily mean we have to do this big, long, overarching survey at the end of an event and the big registration form at the beginning of the event. Because I think while people are engaged, and I use that term lightly, while they're there in the event, online or physically, getting their opinion right there and then is the best. So understanding, if it's an audience member, it's simple things like, was this session what you expected? Did it? Will you learn something? Will you apply something from it afterwards? Even the leads generated argument, I'm not sure whether that ultimately stacks up. I know it's what marketers focus on, number of leads taken away from event, but what's the value of the exposure of being associated with that event, of their brand being in front of those, of the long tail of being part of that event. If they speak at that event, what's the value of that associated with it? There are no defined key metrics. I would love as an industry to come up with that. I think if we came up with some standards and that allowed us to compare events to events and see the differences, that would be fantastic. I don't know if we're going to be able to achieve that.
We'll have a global leaderboard.
But that's also a good thing, because comparison allows us to improve, right? It really does. If we can compare ourselves to our competition or other events of a similar ilk and see the format of that, then it allows us to improve. Data. What data do we collect on people? I don't know. If I'm honest, it's as much as possible. But a key indicator for me is just think about, is somebody satisfied with the event overall? But what's their objective?
I mean, from a live group perspective, we have a whole data working group. The point of which is to look at what we get in a virtual event space, but obviously also in a physical event space, and what therefore can we learn from it? What can we do to improve the event experience? Now, you have to do all of this through data protection, as you should. Mm-hmm. If you're being exploitative with people's data, you're not treating them with respect, and it comes back to this idea of we're a service industry. If delegates don't feel like their information and data is being treated by respect for us, they won't come to our events. And so you have to do it quite carefully. I think always for me, with any of this objectives and parameters, provided that you're comfortable with what you're trying to do and you have a few metrics that you'd be happy with, it's just about setting them in advance and not looking at the minefield of data afterwards and then finding like some bits that, that's kind of good, it was a success, or that conversely, that's kind of bad, what a failure it's been.
Yeah.
If you have the metrics in advance, then you're actually tuning your event towards them, which is a really good place to be, because then you're talking about making events more interesting in terms and objective led, which is what they should be, which is pretty important. So yes, thank you, Vishnu. Good question.
The mistake we make, I think, is we generally try and make all things to all people, don't we? Yeah. We try and cover too many bases. To your point, we try and look at too much, rather than honing down and niching down and really understanding a portion of our audience or that one objective. One objective is enough for most events, I think.
Yeah. Question from Emily. I think there is a misconception that virtual events are always cheaper than physical. Would you agree? And what is the best way to educate clients around this?
Are virtual events always cheaper than?
Well, that's the argument being that there's a misconception around that clients will hear virtual and assume it's cheaper than equivalent physical.
I can tell you it's not. I know some organisers that have spent in excess of $500,000 on a platform, which is a substantial venue budget for any organiser. And arguably you could say, well, if they're not providing delegates with lunches and all that kind of stuff, and AV and all that kind of stuff. But it is a misconception. Virtual events are I think at the moment seemed as what would be deemed as the lesser valued product, but let's take a business like Google, who've done billions and billions in business through ad revenue because they found something that has value to people. The price of that as an individual thing is not now compared to print, because I think people who do print advertising are doing it for a different reason. But yeah, I agree with it. It's a total misconception, because it really depends on what you want to do with that event. But that's also probably driven by some platforms you've been able to deliver a free event on. Hopping's grown massively over the last year because you can deliver a free event on, the same way as Eventbrite grew massively because you could list a free event for free on Eventbrite, and that's where everybody gravitated towards. But
investment money will do that.
Virtual events can be cost effective versus a physical event, but they can also be just as expensive, if not more expensive, in from what I've seen.
Yeah, I think what catches people out, Because if you were to look at kind of two roughly equivalent, you pick a number, I don't know, like an event for 250 people, with a single stage, speakers coming up, and you begin to spec that out, you're probably looking at, yes, I do believe the virtual event would be cheaper because venue costs aren't insignificant by any stretch of the imagination. Like you say, you've got to feed them, give them coffees and all those things. And so that idea becomes kind of fixed in people's minds, which I don't blame. It's a nice, easy metaphor. It's perfectly understandable. What I think trips virtual events up in the costing space is that people's assumptions about what changes the costing matrix and the cost variables are a bit out of whack. Because you think, well, we can increase the numbers from 200 to 5,000 because we don't have a venue to worry about, right? And it's like, yeah, but that brings with it considerations of bandwidth and the reliability of the platform and all those things. And then, we could just run an extra stream, and surely that's easy to spin up because there's no venue. We don't have to worry about room capacities. It's like, yeah, but we have to spin up different production crews. And even the way the show is run in terms of how seamlessly you transition between speakers and what assets you're showing and how well controlled they are and all the briefings that you need to do with speakers. I spoke at Event Tech Live, and very kindly, I did a 30-minute briefing with your tech team, Adam, which was lovely. But I'm guessing that was something you had to pay for.
Yeah, absolutely. The physical event, people generally know how that works. There's no tech check generally there is. Arguably, it happens 5 minutes before that person or people walk on stage, right?
Yeah.
Is the mic working? We take care of everything else. But yeah, absolutely. You have to invest in more because you can't assume, obviously, it would have been the right assumption, that they're experienced in how that process works of coming on camera. Have they done it before? Have they got a good internet connection, lighting, all that kind of stuff? So you have to invest in that as an organizer to make sure that you're still going to get really good output.
Yeah, and kind of coming to the second part of the question, what's the best way to educate clients around this? Like, my genuine belief is that understanding is the key here. That it's not, nobody's trying to get one up on anyone else. It's just about breaking down, here's what the money is going to and what it does for you, and when things need to change, here's why, and here's the benefits and here's the negatives. And it's a lot of work because it'd be like having, and maybe this is what we'll do for next episode, we'll have an atomic physicist on and they can explain to me how quarks work and gluons and all that kind of things, and I'll be nodding along very politely, but whether my level of understanding had been significantly changed by the end of the hour, I don't know. So it's educating in a way that feels inclusive and doesn't take anything for granted, because these things are technically complex and therefore we can't take things for granted in a virtual event space. So it's a mountain to climb, but I think it's one that's eminently climbable.
Yeah, and I think we as an industry, going back to your earlier point, have a role to play in educating everybody that we have as customers, as a market. We are one of those industries, I think probably arguably the only one that touches every other sector. And I think that's what makes us really powerful, is that we can push messaging through to every other part of the world and every other industry, whether that's the sustainability message or anything like that. But the value of what we can do virtually and the cost associated with that when it comes to discussing with customers, we have a job to help them understand why things cost what they do and how to properly budget it. Because I think that's also where people have come wrong, is they've under budgeted, or even in some instances maybe about $500,000 that somebody paid for that event, they were actually being unduly sold to, because it was made out to be more complex than it actually was, or this was the only option, for example. So there's both sides of it. There's the misconception of it being cheap and people not budgeting correctly or not understanding where the money's going for, but also potentially on the other end, either being oversold to or dismissing a supplier or a way of doing things because it looks too expensive. Yeah,
completely. It's tricky. And I don't blame anyone either for not understanding it at first blush, because it takes a lot, and also for getting frustrated that no, these two things aren't equivalent, and that's why there's a change. Question from Yasmin. and she's got 2 questions in. They're kind of roughly the same votes, which is good. Hey, it's democracy. That's what we love. Yasmin says, some data suggests we are seeing a shift to people preferring webinars starting in the afternoon. What's your take on the best timings with so many people working from home right now?
I'd be interested to see that data, Yasmin. I mean, data doesn't generally lie, but I'm actually quite a fan of the breakfast briefing model. I really like that, especially when now events have changed in the digital realm, where somebody would go to a physical event, the out of office went on for the period of time, and everybody appreciated that they were away engaging with something where they'd be, yes, you could get them on the phone, or maybe they reply to an email, but they were out for that period of time and they were given that grace to go off and do that. Whereas now with digital events, programming in the middle of the day, we've got Slack, Microsoft Office, Teams, WhatsApp, messages, everything's going off as a normal day-to-day work. And I actually don't know whether society has adjusted to appreciate that even with a digital event, people should be allowed to switch off from everything else to focus on that event and absorb it and stuff. But the breakfast briefing brings in an element of, especially if it's content-led, like, can I watch this 1-hour webinar while I'm eating my Cocoa Pops and it doesn't really fill the rest of my day off? I don't have to break away, or I don't have to come. For me, the worst times are those early evening times, those things that roll over to like 6, half 6 or something like that, because for me, that's family time. Afternoon, I would argue that it might be a good time for people because they're fed up with work, but are they fully switched on? Are they at their best to absorb or engage with that information that's being provided to them? I can't argue with the data. I've not seen it myself, but I do like that breakfast time kind of morning event personally. I find I'm much more switched on, and it doesn't interfere with the rest of my day. Yeah,
I think we had a data set pre-COVID on webinars, which was, it's limited in so much as it was for specifically 1-hour webinars, which suggested that 11 o'clock, 2 o'clock, they were good moments. They seemed to have the highest audience take up. But the different scenario now, as Yasmin says, people working from home. Like, I have a school run I do now, which is owned because lucky enough that my child can continue to get to school. Now, that means that 8 o'clock's a bit of a wash for me. So if an event starts before then, I can't make it. But I'm a morning person as well, and I do believe that idea of grabbing people's attention before the inertia of the day is built up, and actually it's not just a choice between, am I watching this? Yes. Or am I watching this or replying to these 5 emails that are now niggling at the back of my mind? Or maybe I'll answer them as I watch it. There's a lot of power in that. And if you feel your event has value, that value should be true no matter the time of day. So there's nothing wrong with having a bit of a bolder start time and getting people engaged. It's just tricky if you've got kids in the house right now and you're trying to manage that and the homeschooling thing, and that's changing audiences. Certainly in the UK. I know this is a very UK-centric answer, but that's what I'd certainly think of. I will. I'm mindful of time. And there is a very wide-ranging question, which is Yasmin's second question, which is how do you increase audience engagement at B2B virtual events, for example, Q&A, polls, etc. And do you have any examples to get the audience involved? That's a huge question. I'd be more than happy to have a longer discussion about this very topic in maybe a different episode.
Wow.
Do you have a short answer for that, Adam? Like one word, maybe?
Take the leading role in it. Thread it through your event design from start to finish. If you've got moderators, make sure they're repeatedly mentioning it, encouraging people to submit questions. Feed polls and things like that. For me, it comes in short, sharp bursts. Don't do it with every session. Think about where it makes sense. Make it relevant to the content that's going to be there, then and there. Played on that. Encourage your speakers and your panels and whatever other content you have to also help encourage come up with things like polls and questions and things like that, because my opinion is you generally need to also get the ball rolling with that kind of stuff. So if you, like Bruce, you're today, you've done some work previously to this session to get the ball rolling, to get those questions coming up. And my experience is that at physical or digital events, once people see other people asking and engaging and stuff, that's when everybody else is encouraged to do it. But if you thread it through as part of your event design from start to finish, and not just make it like the big thing that starts at the beginning of the event or in the middle or at the end, then you get much more out of it. And for me, speakers can get a huge amount of value out of being a part of that. So you don't have to come up with the question or the poll for their session, but they can glean value from it as well and make it super relevant. So that's my opinion. Don't just expect to put a Q&A system up and all of a sudden a raft of questions come on. There is data and research to suggest that, anonymizing things helps, because people are more comfortable with asking difficult questions and tough questions around things, especially. They're not going to get called out from the audience, so to say. So maybe that's one way to go as well. And don't always necessarily think that you have to do that as part of the event. Do it before the event. Give something people to engage with before. We did it for a breakfast briefing, and we used the same Q&A solution that we used at the event. And we got like 40 questions for an hour session prior to that event, because we made it live. Everybody else could see other people answering and putting questions in and stuff, and upvoting and all that kind of stuff. And that really worked really well. So I don't necessarily think you just have to do it at while the event's actually on.
Yeah. I mean, very biased head of content answer, but I think you have to put content under the microscope, and that means working with speakers to get them to understand this isn't something that goes against what they're trying to do. It supports it. And if you can build it in a way that's organic and is also in the wider macro view of the agenda, while it takes work, it's always worthwhile. And just like I would always encourage it for a physical event, for a virtual event, it's just as intrinsic, and it's worth putting that time in. But I have to be mindful of time. And there was one question, because I think in this kind of morass of this pandemic, it is sometimes easy to feel yourself beaten down a little bit. So I wanted to ask you, Adam, what gives you hope for this year?
I guess what gives me hope for this year is that we do have a vaccine rollout happening. We're in a much better position than we were last year. We are learning more about how to do events when we can't hold them physically, and that can only help us to produce those virtual events better, with more value, more direction. And I'm seeing a change step in mind of that virtual and digital or online events are here as part of the long stay of how we make events. There was a sense last year for me that it was okay for now. And then we kind of roll back and ditch it like a hot potato. And I think now that we've actually had long enough, people are realizing there's many advantages to digital and virtual events where physical events won't make sense. So that's a good thing for our industry, because it opens up the doors to new revenue, new jobs, new roles, new ways of doing business, maybe even helps us as event organizers connect the community up better, more long term. So yeah, that's my answer to that, mate.
It's a good reason to be hopeful. If people want to get connected with you, Adam, what's the best way of doing things? If there's any follow-ons from you? Oh, I mean, it's not just CES going to hunt you down, is it? But what's the best way of getting in touch?
Email editor@eventindustrynews.com, or you can tweet some hate at me at Punchtown Parry on Twitter.
Okay, so all the hate's on Twitter. That's where it belongs. But yeah, all the good stuff goes on email. Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining me for this. I hope you found it interesting. As always, I found it interesting talking to you. If you're in the wider world watching, thank you for staying with us. Next session, we've got Caitlin, who's one of our senior producers, who'll be talking all about content. I'm excited beyond belief for that session, which is often, for me, it's the hidden thing that absolutely changes everything. If you're a planner or client, it's all about the logistics and costs and budget, and so rarely do you get to take a step back and think, well, what is it they're actually putting on? And we're going to be talking all about that in that session, so please join us for that. If you've watched this before, you know I'm quite an advocate for mental health, and I just want to again put it out there that if you are struggling, please reach out. You're not alone. It is absolutely okay to not be okay. Certainly the start of this year, I found myself in a bit of morass that I've pulled myself out of, and it's tricky times right now, and there's nothing wrong with that. So please be mindful. There are other people that care about you. And I always think it's important to say that. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, Adam. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
and as always, if you want to get in touch with Live Group, the link's at the top. It's hello at Live Group. We'd love to talk to you. We're like that. We're really nice people. And thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.